Distinguished guests, professors, students, and alumni, a very good afternoon to all of you. My name is Tiffany Koh, an honors year student at the National University of Singapore History Department, and I'm honored to serve as your MC for today's event. On behalf of NUS Libraries and the NUS Buddhist Studies Group, I warmly welcome all of you to attend today's event, the launch of Taixu in Singapore, a 100-year commemoration exhibition. Master Taixu was known as one of the most influential Chinese Buddhist monks of the 20th century, and he is best known for his efforts to modernize Buddhism and make it relevant to a rapidly changing world. Marking the centenary of his first visit to Singapore in 1926, the Taixu in Singapore exhibition, curated by Associate Professor Jack Taixu, Chair of the NUS Buddhist Studies Group, is accompanied by a special launch lecture on humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. Together, this brings renewed attention to Taixu's enduring influence on the development of Buddhism in Singapore and also the wider region. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce Assistant Professor Jessie Lefevre, the moderator for today's event. Jessie Lefevre is an Assistant Professor in the Department of Japanese Studies and a graduate of the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. He is a specialist in both the pre-modern and modern religious traditions, literatures, and cultures of Japan. His current research interests include the relationship between disaster and formation of religious cultures, visual culture, and legally sanctioned violence, cultures of non-religiousness, and Korean religion and film. Professor Lefevre will deliver the welcome remarks and moderate the discussion. Professor, please.
Thank you so much. So it's an honor to be invited to moderate today's important exhibition lecture, Taixu in Singapore, 100-year commemoration, which brings so many of us together. Of course, this exhibition would not be possible without the generous support of the National University of Singapore, the team of experts here at the NUS libraries, and of course the vibrant Singaporean community of Buddhist practitioners and scholars who have inherited, promoted, and extended Taixu's vision into the present through their daily lives and in their support of this exhibition. To these acknowledgements, I would like to add that this exhibition would not have been possible without today's esteemed speaker, Dr. Jack Taixu. His research is community outreach. Dr. Shah is the Bohai Associate Professor of Buddhist Studies here at the National University of Singapore, where he also serves as the Assistant Dean of Research at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. He is an historian of religion with a focus on Buddhism and Chinese religions in Southeast Asia. Dr. Shah also is the founding chair of the Buddhist Studies Group and the co-chair of the G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster. Born and raised in Singapore, Dr. Shah earned his PhD in history at Cornell University, where his dissertation received the Lauriston Sharp Prize. He holds a BA with honors and an MA in history from the National University of Singapore, as well as a second MA in East Asian Studies from Harvard University, where he was a Harvard Yenching Fellow. Before joining NUS, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Shah co-chairs the Theravada Studies Group for the internationally recognized Association for Asian Studies and serves as a board member for the Society for the Study of Chinese Religions. He's an editor for numerous journals, including Asian Culture and the Journal of Global Buddhism. He also serves on the editorial boards for the book series Chinese Buddhism and Asian Civilization with Springer Press and Religion in Contemporary Asia by Ducoy. He is also a member of the Heritage Advisory Panel and the National Collection Advisory Panel of the National Heritage Board. In addition, Dr. Shah is already one of the most prolific Buddhist scholars of his generation. His first book, Monks in Motion, Buddhism and Modernity Across the South China Sea, published with Oxford University in 2023, was awarded the 2021 EuroCS Humanities Book Prize and was shortlisted for the 2023 Frederick Weller Prize. Having been translated into both Chinese and Indonesian, this work continues to make an impact on academic circles around the globe. His second book, Southeast Asia's Dharma, Essays on Buddhism in Singapore, was published in Chinese with Boyan 2025 and explores the historical evolution and contemporary transformations of Buddhism in Singapore and its regional connections. His edited volume, Figures of Buddhist Diplomacy in Modern Asia, was supported by the 2020 Social Science and Humanities Research Fellowship awarded by the Social Science Research Council, launched this year with much fanfare and eager reception. This book traces 22 monastic, lay, and political figures who were engaged in Buddhist diplomacy from the early 20th century to the present. Dr. Shah is currently developing two new book projects, Bodhayana, The Making of an Indonesian Buddhist Movement, which offers the first comprehensive account of the rise and transformation of the Bodhayana movement in Indonesia, and Buddhist Diplomacy, A Global History, which investigates the historical trajectories and transregional dimensions of Buddhist diplomacy from its earliest origins to the contemporary world. Given his deep expertise in the history of Chinese Buddhism in Southeast Asia, and his engagement with the ongoing contemporary development of Buddhist communities throughout the region and beyond, Dr. Shah is uniquely positioned to give us insights into the last century, these last 100 years, and to help us understand the context and influence of one of the great modern Buddhist masters, Taixu, in Singapore, as we approach this moment of 100 years of commemoration. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jack Shah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lafiba, for the extremely kind and generous introduction. And good afternoon, colleagues, friends, and students. Thank you all for joining us for today. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of the exhibition, Taixu in Singapore, 100-year commemoration. It is a great pleasure to see so many of you here today. This exhibition marks the 100th anniversary of Master Taixu's first visit to Singapore in 1926, a moment that was far more than a passing encounter. It was, in many ways, the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Buddhism in Singapore and the wider region. Taixu was one of the most important Buddhist reformers of the 20th century. He envisioned a form of Buddhism which he considered human life Buddhism that was not confined to temples or ritual life, but actively engaged with society and responded to the challenges of the modern world. What is especially significant and what this exhibition and today's lecture highlight is that Singapore was not merely a stop along his travels. Rather, it was an important site where his ideas took root, engaged with local communities, and helped shape the development of modern, socially engaged Buddhism. Through his visits in 1926, 1928, and 1940, Taixu contributed to the formation of new institutions, the strengthening of lay Buddhist organizations, and the emergence of Singapore as a regional hub within transnational Buddhist networks. In this sense, the exhibition invites us to rethink Singapore not simply as a recipient of religious ideas, but as an active site in the making of modern Chinese Buddhism. More broadly, this exhibition speaks to a larger theme that is very close to my own research interests, the movement of ideas, people, and resources across borders. It reminds us that Buddhism in Singapore has always been shaped by connections across the South China Sea, Indian Ocean, and beyond. By bringing together rare books, commemorative volumes, and collected works from the NUS library collections. This exhibition allows us to see the connections in a vivid and tangible way. It also highlights the role of public history in making scholarly knowledge accessible, inviting a wider audience to learn about the historical processes that help shape Buddhism in Singapore. This exhibition would not have been possible without the support of many individuals. First, I would like to thank University Librarian Associate Professor Natalie Pang for her support, as well as my wonderful library colleagues, Chai Kim, Gandhi, and Zaki, for the collaboration in making this exhibition possible. This exhibition is truly a collective effort, and it shows what can be achieved when historians and librarians work closely together. I would also like to express my deep gratitude to Sisi for her assistance, as well as to Ray Song for his support with the logistics behind the scene. Finally, I hope that today's lecture and exhibition will deepen our understanding of Taixu and its legacy and inspire further research, conversation, and reflection on Singapore's place in the history of Chinese Buddhism. 现在请允许我用中文说几句话。首先，感谢各位今天抽空来参加太虚访狮城百年纪念展览的开幕式。我很高兴看到这么多同事、朋友和同学来到现场。这次展览是为了纪念太虚大师在1926年第一次访问新加坡，到现在正好100年。那次访问不只是短暂停留，从多方面来说，它标志着新加坡乃至更大范围内佛教历史一个新篇章的开始。太虚大师是20世纪最重要的佛教改革家之一，他提倡的人生佛教不局限在寺院里或仪式上，而是主张佛教要走入社会，回应现代世界的各种挑战。尤其重要的是，正如这次展览和今天的讲座所展示的，新加坡不只是他路过的地方，更是一个重要的实践地点。在这里，他的思想扎下了根，与本地的人们互动，也推动了人生佛教的发展。太虚大师在1926年、1928年和1940年3次来到新加坡，通过这些访问，他促成了新制度的建立，加强了居士佛教组织的力量，也让新加坡逐渐成为跨国佛教网络中的一个区域中心。从这个意义上说，这次展览让我们重新思考新加坡的角色，它不只是宗教思想的接受者，更是现代佛教形成过程中的一个积极参与者。最后，我希望这次展览和讲座不仅让大家更好地了解太虚大师和他的思想，也鼓励大家进一步研究和反思新加坡在汉传佛教历史上的地位。谢谢大家。Thank you again for joining us. So I will now begin my lecture, Across the South China Sea, the Making of Humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. So a quick show of hand, how many of you here have heard of this term, 人间佛教 or humanistic Buddhism before? Quick show of hand. Wow, that's great. So many experts today who are familiar with this idea of 人间佛教 or humanistic Buddhism. So my lecture today, I'm going to give you a brief history, 100-year history of humanistic or human realm Buddhism, 人间佛教 in Singapore. So I have about 15 minutes, so I have to cover, each year in about 2 minutes. I'm just kidding. But for today's lecture, a very important argument I will make is that we need to consider humanistic Buddhism as in a way that is not a monolithic category. In other words, there are many different ways to understand the history and development of humanistic Buddhism. So in other words, there's no monolithic, there's no single humanistic Buddhism, and especially so in a Singapore context. So in today's lecture, I'll unpack this category of humanistic Buddhism, especially in Singapore. And I will talk about humanistic Buddhism in 3 phases. So we're going to look at 3 different periods of development in the history of humanistic Buddhism. And so first, I will offer a very brief overview of Buddhism in Singapore to give you some historical background and context, how Chinese Buddhism arrived in Singapore in the 19th century, how Chinese Buddhism was practiced in the Singapore context before the arrival of new ideas of Buddhist reform in the 20th century. Second, the second part of today's lecture, I will talk about Taixu's human life Buddhism. I will give you a quick overview of Taixu's life and also his 3 visits to Singapore, which is the focus of today's exhibition as well, in which we commemorate Taixu's 100th year visit, the 100th anniversary of Taixu's visit to Singapore. For the third part of today's lecture, I will talk about Yen Pei's, Venerable Yen Pei's idea of humanistic Buddhism. So Venerable Yen Pei was a disciple of Master Taixu, and he was also a disciple of Master Yin Shun. And how he introduced these ideas of Buddhist reform in Singapore in the 1960s. That was the time when he migrated to Singapore and started Buddhist organizations here. And he played a very important role in promoting humanistic Buddhism in post-colonial independent Singapore. And last but not least, I will talk about some of the recent Taiwanese Buddhist organizations that came to Singapore in the 1980s and 90s. And these organizations promoted different visions of humanistic Buddhism in Singapore and how they contributed not only to the propagation of Buddhism, but also promoted social welfare and cultural activities in the Singapore context. So let me begin with a quick history of Buddhism in Singapore. And interestingly, the history of Buddhism in Singapore has got to do with our colonial history. Of course, Raffles was not a Buddhist. He did not bring Buddhism to Singapore. But Raffles came to Singapore and made Singapore a British colony. And as a British colony, it became a very important port in Asia. And the rise of Singapore as an entry port contributed to migration and which led to the arrival of Buddhism in the 19th century. So in other words, I always tell my students that Raffles indirectly contributed to the arrival and emergence of Buddhism in Singapore. Not directly, but indirectly. So with the migration to Singapore, we see Chinese migrants from the southern parts of China, including Fujian and Guangdong provinces. And my ancestors, my grandfather came from Guangdong. So many early Chinese migrants came from the southern Chinese provinces of Guangdong and Fujian. And when they came to Singapore, they brought with them both Chinese Buddhism and Chinese folk religious practices to Singapore and also other parts of Southeast Asia. And at the same time, migrants from South Asia, for example, from Sri Lanka, as well as migrants from other parts of Southeast Asia, including Burma, Thailand, and Cambodia, also migrated to Singapore. And for them, they actually brought with them Theravada Buddhism, which is another stream of Buddhism in Singapore. So that was the reason why by the beginning of the 20th century, we see the rise of several Buddhist organizations, not only Chinese Mahayana organizations that were established by Chinese migrants, but also Theravada Buddhist organizations that were established by South and South Asian migrants. So this is a quick map on the Chinese in Southeast Asia. So I mentioned earlier that most of the Chinese that came to Southeast Asia came from the southern Chinese provinces of Fujian and Guangdong, and they migrated to different parts of Southeast Asia. And of course, many of them came to this part known as Maritime Southeast Asia and settled in not only Singapore, but also in other parts of Malaysia, for example, Malacca, Kuala Lumpur, Ipoh, and Penang, as well as in parts of Indonesia, including Jakarta. At the time was the Dutch colony known as Batavia, Dhirubhaya and Maidan as well. So we see the spread of the Chinese community, but also the arrival of Chinese Buddhism. So when Chinese Buddhism first arrived in Southeast Asia and Singapore, many Chinese practiced a form of what we would consider folk or popular Buddhism. So what was this folk or popular Buddhism? But this was the kind of Buddhism that what scholars would consider as the unity of the three teachings of Sanjiao Heyi. They kind of combine Buddhism, Taoism, and the Confucian practice of ancestor worship. So it's very often, if you look at a kind of folk Chinese Buddhist author, you will see them Chinese worshipping, for example, like Buddha or a very popular Buddhist author, the Guan Yin Bodhisattva, or the Avalokiteshvara as well. I think we have the Guan Yin, but also we have Chinese deities as well. And also some Chinese will worship ancestor tablet as part of this kind of Confucius rite of ancestor veneration. So this kind of Buddhism was a kind of mix of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas with Chinese deities and ancestor worship. And the popular belief among the Chinese community was that the more gods you worship, the more blessings you get, right? The 拜的神多神保 you, right? So they are not concerned about whether it is Orthodox Buddhist teachings, whether it is about Buddha, Bodhisattva, or Dua Peitong, a popular Chinese deity. They worship all and hope to get blessings for the Buddhas and the deities. So this was a common kind of Buddhism, and of course, many early Buddhists engaged in ceremonies and rituals, including, for example, like divination. They would go and get their divination lot. They would seek fortune telling and also burn joss paper for blessings and so on. Right. So these are the kind of popular Chinese religious practices that we see in early Chinese Buddhism in Singapore, but it also continues today. Right. That we will still see many of these practices today in Singapore. So by the early 20th century, we see the gradual shift from folk Buddhism to institutional Buddhism. And by institutional Buddhism, we are talking about the emergence of Buddhist monasteries and organizations. And many of these Buddhist monasteries and organizations were established by migrant missionary monks from China. So these monks were educated in the Dharma. So they came to Southeast Asia to propagate the Dharma. So that was one of their mission. But another very important thing that they wanted to do was actually to do fundraising as well to support the Buddhist reform movement in China, but also later on, as I mentioned earlier, to actually support the Chinese war effort in the Second Sino-Japanese War. So some of these missionaries came to Singapore for Dharma propagation and for fundraising, and gradually they established Buddhist monasteries. And some of these prominent monasteries were established. The earliest Chinese Buddhist monastery was established in 1898, which is the Xiongling Monastery or the Shuangling, which is a national monument. And that temple was established by Venerable Xian Hui with the support of a very prominent, wealthy Chinese businessman, or in Singapore, a wealthy Taoge, Liu Qingtang. And he contributed to the establishment of the Xiongling Monastery, the oldest monastery in Singapore. And gradually, we have monks from the Fujian region, the Hokkien monks, came to Southeast Asia to establish Buddhist monasteries as well. So we saw the establishment of Longshan Si, the Longshan Si temple by Venerable Zhuan Wu in 1913, and subsequently Venerable Zhuan Dao came to Singapore to establish first the Putuo Qi or the Putuo Si. And so the MC today, my advisee Tiffany just completed a wonderful honors thesis on the Putuo Temple in Singapore. So if you wish to learn more about the Putuo Qi, right, talk to her. And the most prominent Buddhist monastery in Singapore today, which is the largest in Singapore, is the Dongmei Sampokasi Monastery, which I will talk more about later on. And that was the temple that was established by Venerable Zhuan Dao as well. And that became one of the most prominent Buddhist monasteries in Singapore, established in 1920. So with that, I'm going to now change gear, and now I'm going to talk about Master Taixu. So now another quick show of hands. How many of you here have heard of Master Taixu? All right. Oh, wow. Many answers are great. So I'm glad that we have many Taixu experts with us today as well. So Master Taixu actually needs no introduction because he's very famous. He, in fact, was one of the most prominent Buddhist reformers in modern Chinese history. He was born in 1890 in Zhejiang and became a novice in Jiangsu. Subsequently, he received his higher ordination at the Tiantong Monastery in Ningbo. And he was classmates with some of the most prominent monks of his time, including Venerable Huiquan, who was actually the master of Singapore's most well-known monk, Venerable Hong Chuan. So you probably have heard of Venerable Hong Chuan, the second abbot of Gongmengshan Pagasi Monastery. So Venerable Huiquan was the master of Venerable Hong Chuan. So he was a classmate of Master Taixu, along with Venerable Yuan Ying as well, another very prominent Buddhist monk during the Republican period. So Taixu, Huiquan, and Yuan Ying received their monastic training together under the tutelage of Master Jichan, one of the very important Buddhist teachers during the late Qing and the early Republican period. And subsequently, Taixu studied under two very prominent Buddhist scholars, who were actually not Buddhist monks, but prominent scholars of the time who promoted Buddhist reform. And the two important scholars were Yang Wenhui and Su Mansu. Yang Wenhui, Su Mansu, and a group of Chinese Buddhist scholars actually established the Jatavana Vihara in Nanjing, and it became a very important institution for Buddhist reform during the late Qing and the early Republican period. And this was the place where many reform-minded monks actually went to the Jatavana Vihara to study with Yang Wenhui and Su Mansu. And so Master Taixu was greatly influenced by the idea of Buddhist reform. And because of this influence, Taixu, by the early 1920s, decided to spearhead this movement known as the Buddhist revival movement in Republican China, known as the Fojiao Fuxing Yundong. And this movement had several objectives, but two of the most important aims were, first, Dharma propagation, that they wanted to promote the Dharma in China and teach the masses about what the Buddha's teachings is about. And second, there was this emphasis on promoting education, not only religious education, but they were also supporters of secular education, right? And this was very much of a product of after the 1911 revolution in China. We saw the rise of the new cultural movement and the Mayfair movement. So many of these Buddhist reformers were very much influenced by this idea of the Mayfair, right? Promoting science and democracy, and of course modern education. And that was very much the kind of idea as well that influenced the Buddhist reformist community at the time, right? To educate monks and also to make them, allowing them to make Buddhism relevant to the modern world. So Taixu, therefore, in 1922, founded a very important Buddhist seminary known as the Wuchang Buddhist Studies Academy. And of course, as the name suggests, it's located in Wuchang. And it became a very prominent seminary that trained reform-minded monks. And a year later, in 1923, he became the inaugural president of the World Buddhist Fellowship. And the World Buddhist Fellowship was established as a kind of ecumenical Buddhist organization to bring Buddhist communities together and also to think about how to reform Buddhism and make Buddhism relevant to the modern world. So he became a very important leader in this movement. And in 1927, Taixu succeeded Huiquan. As I mentioned, they were classmates. So he succeeded Huiquan to become the abbot of the famous Nanputuo Monastery and the rector of the Mingnan Buddhist Institute in Xiamen, in the Fujian province of China. And because of that, Mingnan Buddhist Institute, or Mingnan Foshuan, became a very important center for Buddhist reform in southern China. So Taixu promoted, Taixu's reformist idea is centered based on his notion or his concept of human life Buddhism, or what he called 人生佛教. So he actually came up with 人生佛教. It was his disciples, which I will talk about, that promoted this idea of 人间佛教, that is a more commonly known term today, which is humanistic Buddhism. So according to Master Taixu, human life Buddhism or 人生佛教 was something that he argued can be a remedy for Chinese Buddhism and how 人生佛教 can make Buddhism relevant to the modern world. So he wanted a Chinese Buddhism that was beyond death, funeral rites, and other worldly salvation. And that was very much the focus of the Chinese Buddhist community during this time. And in fact, many of the Chinese monks at the time were called ritual specialists, right? That they were actually hired by families to perform rituals when someone passed away. And of course, this was a very profitable business, right? So many of them conduct rituals actually to make money, right? So this was something that Taixu was against. And also Taixu, because of that, wanted to change the image of Buddhism and from the kind of image of Buddhism as a religion for the day, because of this stereotypical image of Buddhism that's connected to funeral rites, to Buddhism for a living. So because of that, he sought to eradicate what he considered as superstitious or missing, right, practices in Chinese Buddhism to make Buddhism a modern, rational religion, right, in the context of modern China. So Taixu's idea of human life Buddhism or 人生佛教 was also a way to promote a type of utopian ideal of establishing a pure land in the human world. Because Taixu believed that Buddhists should not be only focusing on the other worldly salvation, because at that time, also some Buddhists, other than focusing on funerals, they were focusing on reciting the name of the Buddha, right? The kind of pure land practice, 念佛法门, and they want to be reborn in the Western Pure Land, and which after they pass away. But Taixu believed that Buddhism is also for this human world. So he wanted Buddhists to promote a pure land in this world rather than to think about other worldly salvation only. So this idea is what he considered as building what he called a 人间净土, right? Making Buddhism applicable in the human world. So Taixu made 3 visits to Singapore in 1926, 1928, and 1940. And his first visit was in September 1926. So he came to Singapore and gave a series of talks at the Victoria Memorial Hall. Now, when we think about the Victoria Memorial, Victoria Concert Hall, we often associate that with the Singapore Symphony Orchestra concert. So no one can imagine that 100 years ago, actually, that was a place for important lectures, and Master Taixu was there to give a lecture about human life Buddhism, right? So next time you go to attend an SSO concert, imagine, wow, Taixu was there giving a lecture. So in one of his lectures, Taixu actually proposed the establishment of a lay Buddhist association in Singapore. And that was very important because by the early 1920s, right, there were several Buddhist organizations in Singapore, as I mentioned earlier. But most of these organizations were Buddhist monasteries, right? So these were monasteries for the monastics. There were very few activities for the lay community in Singapore. So therefore, Taixu came up with this idea of promoting lay Buddhism and proposed the establishment of a lay Buddhist association. And this inspired Ning Da-yun, who was a very prominent Chinese lay Buddhist, but also a prominent wealthy Chinese businessman of Taoge in Singapore, to establish the first lay Buddhist organization. So a year later, Ning Da-yun, with the support of Venerable Zhuan Dao, and as I mentioned earlier, Venerable Zhuan Dao was the founder of the Pu Tuo Zhi and the Gongming Sanpo Gaxi Monastery in Singapore. So he was very influential, and he greatly supported this idea. So a year later, Ning Da-yun and Venerable Zhuan Dao collaborated and founded the Chinese Buddhist Association, or 中华佛教会, in Chinatown's Telok Ayer in 1927. And of course, next year will mark the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the 中华佛教会. And a very interesting fun fact for you that my advisee, Dong Wei Kai, just finished a master's thesis on the Chinese Buddhist Association. So if you're interested, please read his thesis. Right? So Singapore Chinese Buddhist Association or 中华佛教会 was the first lay Buddhist organization and it promoted human life Buddhism. But more importantly, it played an important role in promoting Buddhist education and welfare services to the Chinese migrant community living in Chinatown. So that's why it explains the location of the lay organization. So the Chinese Buddhist Association also became a very important inspiration for future lay Buddhist organization. And of course, a few years later, one of the most prominent lay Buddhist organizations, the Singapore Buddhist Lodge, or the Singapore 佛教居士林 was established in 1934. So we see the rise of lay Buddhist organizations thanks to Taixu's vision. But Taixu also had another idea. So Taixu was a reformist monk full of ideas, right? So, and because of that, he was considered one of the very innovative but also controversial monks during his time. So there were very many Buddhists who supported his ideas, but there were also many Buddhists during this time in Republican China who are against his reformist ideas. So we see also this kind of tensions, right, where with new ideas, right, also sometimes met with resistance as well. But one very interesting innovative idea that Taixu proposed was this idea of a Nanyang Buddhist Association or Nanyang 佛教会. And he wanted a regional Buddhist organization to connect the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and Singapore to create this Buddhist networks in Southeast Asia. And he wanted Singapore to serve as a regional hub for Buddhist missionary activities. So he wanted Singapore, and of course, even Singapore's strategic location, right, at the colonial port city, at the crossroad of the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. It would be a very strategic location for Buddhist missionary or Dharma propagation activities. But so he wanted to connect the three maritime Southeast Asian states, and more importantly, connect the region to the broader international Buddhist networks. And of course, one of these important Buddhist networks was the World Buddhist Fellowship that Taixu was a part of, right? But interestingly and unfortunately, right, this was never materialized. But later, we are going to see how Venerable Yin Pei was able to materialize this vision of making Singapore a hub in the global Buddhist networks. So for Taixu's third visit to Singapore, he invited a very important disciple to come to Singapore with him and met with Venerable Ci Han. And so in 1940, Taixu came to Singapore, and that was during the time of the Second Sino-Japanese War. So on the one hand, Taixu was in Southeast Asia, and also, in fact, he also went on this global tour, right, to South Asia as well, to propagate Buddhism on the one hand, but on the other hand, to raise funds and also to gain support for China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. So it was a kind of global tour of Asian countries. So Taixu invited his disciple Ci Han to come with him to sought support for the Second Sino-Japanese War. So after this trip, Taixu actually returned back to China, but his disciple Ci Han wanted to stay in Southeast Asia to promote the Dharma. So Ci Han actually stayed in Singapore, and he played an important role in the establishment of Buddhist institutions and schools. So he founded the Lingfeng Buddhist Institute, or the Lingfeng Buddhist. I'm going to talk more about this organization later, and also the monastic dormitories to host visiting monks to propagate the Dharma in Singapore. He was also a very important leader that contributed to the establishment of the Maha Buddhist School in Singapore, so, which is one of the 3 Buddhist schools in Singapore. So he also contributed to the expansion of the 4-day school or the Buddhist in Penang as well, because he was a very important supporter of Buddhist education. So this was the image of Taixu and Ci Han in Singapore. So on this image, as you can see over here, so this is Master Taixu, this is Venerable Zhuang Dao, which I mentioned, the founder of the Gongsan Monastery Monastery. And on Zhuang Dao's left was Venerable Ci Han. And it's also very interesting to note that Venerable Ci Han often dressed in Theravada robes, right? Because he was trained in both the Mahayana tradition, he was a disciple of Master Taixu, but he was also trained in the Theravada tradition as well. So in many of his photographs in Southeast Asia, he was actually dressed in Theravada robes. A very interesting fun fact about Ci Han. After his Dharma propagation journey in Singapore, actually he went to Taiwan and established the Mila, the organization in Taipei known as Mila Neiyue. And Ci Han was believed to be to be the kind of a practitioner of the Maitreya school of Buddhism. So when he actually passed away, they believe that he was like a kind of manifestation of the Maitreya Bodhisattva. And in fact, his body actually never decayed, right? So if you have a chance to visit Mila Neiyue in Taipei, you can still see his body. In fact, they call him like the kind of Roshan Pusa, right? That his body never decay, and in fact you can still see Ci Han today. And some years ago, there was a very interesting trip where Mila Neiyue actually brought the body of Ci Han across the strait to visit the monasteries in mainland China. So it was a kind of a huge a Buddhist kind of pilgrimage, right? For the we call it the kind of the Buddhist mummy, right? The Roshan Pusa, right? It's really interesting. And if you're interested, you can find the documentary on YouTube, right? So if you're also interested to find out more about Taixu's third visit to Singapore in 1940, you can read my advisee, Ng Xiangyin's article published in Journal of Chinese Religion last year, Journey to the South, Chinese Buddhist Missions to South and Southeast Asia. And of course, my good friend and colleague, Professor Dan Sen at NYU Shanghai, published a very important piece about Taixu's goodwill mission to India in 1940 as a part of this journey to visit different Southeast Asian countries, where he met the Nehru, who later became the first Prime Minister of India at that time. Right? So these are very interesting articles if you wish to find out more. So next, for the second part of my lecture, I will talk about Venerable Yen Pei. And Venerable Yen Pei was one of the most prominent socially engaged Buddhist monks in post-colonial Singapore. And many Buddhists consider him as not only a prolific Buddhist scholar, but also a prominent social activist. So he was born in 1917 in Jiangsu, after Yen Pei traveled south to Xiamen to be enrolled at the famous Mingnan Buddhist Institute, which I mentioned earlier. So at the Mingnan Buddhist Institute, he studied under prominent Buddhist reformers, including Master Taixu and Master Yingshun, who were two of the very important Buddhist reformers during this time. And of course, Master Yingshun was a disciple of Master Taixu. So he was a very prominent Buddhist reformer, and Yen Pei became a student of Buddhist thinker Master Taixu because of became a student of Master Yingshun because of Master Taixu. And we're going to show you a short little video clip later on, which was an oral history recording of Venerable Yen Pei. And he talked about how Master Taixu asked Master Venerable Yen Pei to study under Master Yingshun. So Master Yingshun was a very important thinker, and he promoted this idea of humanistic Buddhism based on Indian Buddhism. So according to Master Yingshun, who was a Buddhist thinker and scholar, he actually claimed that the idea that Buddhism in early India had degenerated when it became assimilated with the theistic kind of religious tradition. And therefore, he believed that Buddhists should practice the Dharma and strive to achieve Buddhahood in the human world. And of course, he was very much influenced by the teachings and the idea of 人生佛教 or human-like Buddhism by Master Taixu. However, Master Yingshun came up with this idea of a humanistic Buddhism or human-right Buddhism or 人间佛教 based on his interpretation of early Buddhist doctrines. So according to him, he argued that humans should aspire to practice the Buddhist subtle path of the great vehicle or the Mahayana in order to enter the Buddha's vehicle, or what he considered as Ochen. So in his very important book known as The Way to the Buddhahood or Chengfo Zhidao, he actually emphasized the uniqueness of the Mahayana, which he called the Dacheng Gongfa, and the kind of foundational, fundamental teachings of humanistic Buddhism, right? So in other words, his interpretation, understanding of humanistic Buddhism is a very scholarly one, right? So again, now we're going to unpack different streams of humanistic Buddhism. Okay. So I'm going to show you here a video clip of Venerable Yanpei, a nice oral history recording, and that's where Venerable Yanpei mentioned that Master Taixu encouraged him and his other classmates to learn from Master Yingshun.
当时我们是预备参与这个正版听课，但是太虚大师呢要我们旁听，同时指定我们呢跟应顺老师呢求一的方法。
Yeah, so a very interesting also fun fact for you is that back in the 1960s and 70s when Venerable Yanpei came to teach in Singapore, he spoke in Mandarin Chinese with with a kind of Jiangsu accent, but most Singaporean Chinese actually spoke either Hokkien and Cantonese. So sometimes for some of his Dharma talks, he had to ask his disciple to translate his talks from Mandarin Chinese to Hokkien or other dialects for the Buddhist community. So it was a very interesting time back then when Mandarin Chinese was not the common language spoken by most Singaporean Chinese, right? So it was very interesting to think about that. So Yanpei studied with Master Yingshun at the Sino-Tibetan Institute, and later in 1949, after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, Yanpei and Yingshun left China for first to Hong Kong and later Taiwan. And they became founding members of the Fuyan Vihara in Hsinchu in Taiwan. And this is the image of the Fuyan Vihara. And this is a very iconic image where this is in the middle was Master Yingshun and Venerable Yanpei was on the right. And on the left was the very important visitor, which I'm going to talk about later on. And that was Venerable Master Xingyun, the founder of Foguanshan, and also a very important leaders and also thinkers of humanistic Buddhism. Right? So, in fact, we can see that many Buddhist reformers communicated and supported one another, right, in the time of Buddhist reform. So, Venerable Yanpei later on took on the role as the abbot of the Santao Monastery in Taipei from 1957 to 1960. And Santao Monastery is one of the most prominent Buddhist monasteries in Taipei. And if you take the MRT in Taiwan, right, the subway, the Jieyuan in Taiwan, then you can actually go to the Santao station along the blue line, the Huanan that's where you can see the Santao Monastery. And so in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when Yanpei was the abbot of the Santao Monastery, he was invited to give Dharma talks in Southeast Asia. So he went to Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia to give Dharma talks. And then later on, he was invited to give lectures in Singapore and Malaysia. During his time in Singapore, his Buddhist friends brought him to visit different Buddhist monasteries where he gave talks, and also they brought him to eat durian. Interestingly, according to his autobiography, right, The Confessions of a Foolish Monk, or 一个怀生的自白, that's his autobiography, he mentioned that he loved durian, and because of that, his friends told him, since you like durian, then you can teach in Southeast Asia. So, thanks to that, then in 1964, he decided to migrate to Singapore. Right? And interestingly, in his autobiography, Singapore wasn't his top choice at the time. His first choice was actually Vietnam, because that's where he actually had built a monastery and a community of disciples. But in the 1960s, anyone knows what was happening in Vietnam? Yes, the Vietnam War. And because of the political instability, so his friends told him that no, please come to Singapore instead. So therefore, in 1964, he made up his mind, and a year before Singapore's independence, he migrated to Singapore. And he became the abbot of the Ling Fong Rajna Auditorium, or the Ling Fong Pura Chantan, that Venerable Tzu Hang established, right? So now we see the continuity, right, and connection. And Venerable Yen Pei was a very active Dharma teacher and promoter of humanistic Buddhism, but he expanded Ling Fong Prajna Auditorium to make it a center for Buddhist education in Singapore. But not only in Singapore, but a key point in the global Buddhist networks. Remember, I mentioned about the Nanyang Buddhist Association. So that did not materialize, but Venerable Yen Pei was able to make Ling Fong Prajna Auditorium a very important point in the global Buddhist networks, and many visiting monks came to Singapore to attend talks, to give talks, and to grow the Buddhist community in Singapore. And of course, Venerable Yen Pei was an extremely prolific Buddhist scholar. He not only led Buddhist organizations, gave many Dharma lectures, he was an extremely prolific scholar as well. And in fact, he published a 34-volume collection of essays under the title Collected Works of Mindful Observation, or Di Guan Quan Qi, right? So in fact, yesterday, Dr. Latifa and I were talking about how academics struggle to just finish one book. And yet we have like the great masters like Master Taixu and Venerable Yen Pei publishing, wow, multi-volume books, right? So wow, they are like our role model, right? So in the 1980s, Venerable Yen Pei also saw the need for Singaporeans to be more socially engaged, and of course, this is a very important principle in humanistic Buddhism. So he established the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services, the Singapore Foujian Fuli Xiehui in 1980, and the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services had three major areas, right? First, elder care and filial piety. Second, organ donation and kidney dialysis, and the drug prevention and rehabilitation. So what are these services about? So first, Yen Pei was concerned with the welfare of poor and elderly Singaporeans. So he argued that Singapore is, Buddhism is a religion that places utmost importance on filial piety. And I quote here, in fact, in his important essay, 佛教是最重视孝道的宗教, right? So it's a very much a promotion of this idea or Chinese principle of filial piety, and he led the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services effort in public assistance to support the elderly community. And in 1985, Yen Pei founded Grace Lodge, or the Yu Ci En Ling, to provide shelter for homeless elderly, right? So we see the expansion of Buddhist social welfare services. He was also an active champion of organ donation, and during this time, again back in the 1980s, right, Singapore government was promoting this idea of organ donation. And of course, many Chinese actually did not like the idea of organ donation at the time, because in the kind of Chinese traditional idea, right, they believe that the body should be complete, right, at barrier of cremation. So having the organs missing is a bad thing, right, according to the kind of Chinese idea. But Yen Pei believed that as Buddhists should believe in the idea of the Bodhisattva idea of giving, right? Including if someone passes away, to give away one's organ, it's a great act of compassion. So because of that, Yen Pei promoted and supported organ donation, a organized kidney donation seminar, and a 5-day kidney care exhibition in 1983. And he encouraged Buddhists to donate kidney and other internal organs to the sick, and how he argued that Buddhists should participate actively in the launching of kidney donation. And beyond that, he also founded the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services International Kidney Foundation Dialysis Center in 1992, right? And that was one of the very first Buddhist kidney dialysis centers in Singapore. So, because of Yen Pei's support to organ donation and kidney foundation, so there is a research grant, kidney researcher known as the Venerable Yanpei NKF Research Fund to promote research in kidney diseases, right? So if any of you are interested in conducting research on kidney diseases, right, you can apply for this grant. I think it funds up to almost, I think, $500,000, right? So it's an extremely generous grant, but I think it's only for medical research. I don't know if they will support like historical or social science research on that. Maybe you can, someone can try, right? Yeah. So, and finally, Yanpei was very concerned with the problem of young drug addicts, especially in the 1970s, and he pointed out that Buddhists should be sympathetic to former drug addicts. And with that, he established the Green Heaven, or the Qing Yuan, the first Buddhist halfway house in Singapore in 1993. And that was a very important Buddhist halfway house to help former drug addicts return to the family and reintegrate into society. And by the 1980s and 90s, right, we see the rise of Buddhist welfare organization, a range of Buddhist organizations ranging from the very early Singapore Buddhist Free Clinic that was founded in 1969, which was very early. And by the 1980s and 90s, we see the wide range of Buddhist social welfare organizations, including the Bright Hill Evergreen Home, established by the Gomeng Pogasi Monastery, the Metta Welfare Organization started by Golden Pagoda Temple, Renshire Hospital by Fu Hai Chan Monastery, Sanyo, which is a Buddhist counseling center, and the Singapore Buddhist Lodge Welfare Foundation. And this is only some examples of Buddhist welfare organizations that were established, right? So we can see the expansion of the kind of socially engaged Buddhist organizations, right, and welfare services that emerged during this time. And now in the final part of my lecture, I'm going to say a few words about reformist Buddhism and also zoom in on a few organizations that arrived in Singapore in the 1980s and 90s that promote different visions of humanistic Buddhism. So I want to start this part by talking about my dear friend, Professor Hua Kun Eng's book, State, Society, and Religious Engineering Towards the Reformist Buddhism in Singapore, which is a very important book in the study of Buddhism. In her book, she argued that by the 1980s, we see the Buddhicization of Chinese religious syncretism, the kind of folk practices, to a movement towards reformist Buddhism in Singapore within the Chinese community. And according to Professor Hua, right, the reformist Buddhists engaged in 6 range of religious activities, ranging from propagating Buddhist scriptural knowledge, encouraging general participation, cultivating committed reformist Buddhists, especially through education and Dharma classes, promoting missionary work, putting faith into real life and practice, right, which is very much a principle similar to humanistic Buddhism, and legitimizing visa as a public holiday. And in terms of the secular domain, right, Professor Hua mentioned that many reformist Buddhists engage in charitable Well, lovely coincidence. The Professor Hua's very important book, right, think also about the development of humanistic Buddhism, because it's important to see what Professor Hua had talked about, the rise of reformist Buddhism in Singapore, and how humanistic Buddhism fits very nicely to this narrative and can be seen as an example that contributed to the rise of reformist Buddhism. So for the final part of my lecture, I'm going to talk about 3 case studies of Taiwanese Buddhist organizations that came to Singapore in the 1980s and 90s and contributed to the different visions and propagation of different forms of humanistic Buddhism. So first, we have Mahaprajna Buddhist Society that was established by Venerable Ho Zhong. So Venerable Ho Zhong was a disciple of Master Yin Shun. He studied at the Fuyan Vihara, which I mentioned earlier, and the Huile Auditorium. Both were important Buddhist organizations founded by Master Yin Shun. And he founded the Mahaprajna Buddhist Society in 1985. And I quote here that at the time, temples and many devotees abound, but in actual fact, there were no distinctions made between Buddhism and Taoism of Buddha and beauty, right? An issue that I mentioned about Kampuk Buddhism. So therefore, the Mahaprajna Buddhist Society was established to introduce this idea of humanistic Buddhism to the community in Singapore. And one of the very important approach, right, that Mahaprajna Society uses is to propagate humanistic Buddhism based on Master Yin's idea of the way of Buddhahood, which is 成佛之道. And this is, in a way, packaged into a 3-year Dharma course curriculum, right? So, and this curriculum is a kind of very intensive kind of program that is over 3 years. They start with basic Buddhist teachings and then advance into a 2nd year intermediate and a 3rd year advanced level program. And after passing the 3rd year advanced program, they also have the advanced reading, kind of a bit like in graduate school, right? The kind of independent studies kind of program, right? For you to read the kind of text on humanistic Buddhism. And Mahaprajna Buddhist Society also promoted Buddhist activities, including Dharma talks and Dharma classes, just like many of the reformist Buddhist organizations do. But they also offer a range of social cultural activities, including, for instance, charity, choir, choral arrangement, and even Taixu classes, right? So that's where you can see quite an interesting range of courses, from the Dharma courses for youth and children to choir recruitment. So if you love singing Buddhist songs, like I want to the Buddhist karaoke, then you can join the Buddhist choir. And another prominent organization, of course, is Fo Guang Shan Singapore. And of course, Fo Guang Shan needs no introduction. It's one of the most prominent global Buddhist organizations in the world. And the Fo Guang Shan came to Singapore in 1993 as part of Singapore's chapter of the Buddha's Life International Association. It was established to propagate the Dharma in Singapore. And of course, Fo Guang Shan was an organization that was established by the late Venerable Master Xing Yun that you see on the slide. And of course, next to him was our now current senior minister, Li Xian. So when Master Xing Yun came to Singapore several times to deliver Dharma talks in Singapore. And in 1996, right, the Fo Guang Yuan was founded. And Master Xing Yun regularly visited Singapore to propagate humanistic Buddhism. And in fact, gave many lectures at the time, but at the indoor stadium, right? It was like fully packed, right? So he was a very popular, charismatic speaker. And as his organization grew, and in 2000, Fo Guang Shan Singapore was officially registered and now completed in October 2007. And now they are located in Punggol, right? And so Singapore looks like. And of course, Fo Guang Shan Singapore aims to be an educational institute, as I mentioned earlier as well. Humanistic Buddhism places a lot of emphasis on education. So it aims to promote 4 kinds of activities, right? Through education, benefit society through charity, and purify minds through Dharma services, right? So these are the 4 activities of Fo Guang Shan Singapore. And in fact, there's a book by my colleague, Professor Chen Jianhuang at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and they recently published a history of Singapore, Fo Guang Shan, and humanistic Buddhism. So if you're interested, you check out this book. And the Fo Guang Shan Singapore also they host the Humanistic Buddhism Youth Forum once every 2 years, and that was the forum that was held last year, and yours truly was one of the plenary speakers, right, along with Venerable Miao Guan, one of the prominent teachers at Fo Guang Shan, right. And last but not least, we have Tzu Chi Singapore, right? And again, Tzu Chi needs no introduction. It's probably one of the most well-known Buddhist, global Buddhist charity NGOs in the world, right? And there are also some scholars who call it like Tzu Chi, like very much like the Buddhist version of the Salvation Army, right? Because it's just so global, so well-known. So Tzu Chi Singapore was registered in 1993. And it established an island-wide network of volunteers, including Dharma propagation, philanthropic activities, and also promote recycling, right? So in some of the neighborhood, you might have received like pamphlets by Tzu Chi, right, informing you that items, right, from your household, right? So this is one of the major things that they do. And in 2019, Tzu Chi established the Tzu Humanistic Youth Center in Yixun to promote equal awareness, youth wellness, volunteering, arts and culture, and young parenting. And this is one of the new initiatives that Tzu has been actively promoting. And this is a photograph of the opening ceremony. So Minister Shanmugam was the guest of honor, and of course, this we have the president, Mr. Liu, who was there, and that was the one of the very important initiatives that Tzu was that is trying to do is to promote the humanistic Buddhist values to the younger generation. And one very interesting thing to know about Tzu is that they actually wear uniform. Both of you, their role and in a way the kind of their rank in the organization. So very senior members, right, are dressed with the tie, and for the ladies, right, in the type of Qingtao, right? Yeah. But then for the younger volunteers and members, they actually wear the light blue polo t-shirt, while the older members I shouldn't say older, more senior members will wear the dark blue, right? We see it on the clothing, you can see, the role they play in the organization. So it's very interesting and very much again like Salvation Army as well, right? They have different ranks, right, for the important leaders and members of the organization. So it's a very interesting kind of comparison. So with that, I'm going to say a few words before we commence our Q&A. So first, my lecture today has talked about the kind of development of Master Taixu's human life Buddhism and how it gradually developed into the kind of humanistic Buddhism that we understand today, and especially in the Singapore context. And second, I have talked about the localization of humanistic Buddhist organization, so ranging from the establishment of very early human life Buddhist organization, the Zhonghua Gujiahui, to Venerable Yanpei's vision of humanistic Buddhism, and also the emergence of local charitable Buddhist organization, as well as the arrival of Taiwanese Buddhist organizations in the 80s and 90s. And finally, something for us to think about is to think about the impact and long-term development of humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. And Professor Tua Kun Eng also a few years ago published a very important book to think about Buddhist philanthropy in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And this book, I think, is a very important way for us to think about the long-term development and impact of humanistic Buddhism, to think about it in the context of philanthropy, to think about that in the context in education, and to think about Buddhism in the context of social activism, about environmentalism, and so on. So there are many different ways that we can think about humanistic Buddhism, especially in the Singapore context. And I think this is something that I hope future researchers, and I see many students here today, can think about as you develop your research project. But also, I hope this will also help us to think about the place of Singapore in the global Buddhist reform and network. So with that, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope you like my AI generated.
So please take a seat while we rearrange a bit. Ladies and gentlemen, we will soon begin the question and answer session. May I invite Professor Chia to the floor to answer any questions, and Professor Lekuma to moderate the session. Professors, please.
Thank you. As it goes with Buddhist sermons, often we see in the sutras that it was the Buddha's sermon that was good in the beginning, good in the middle, good at the end. I think that today we can also say that. And I'm going to use a three-part summary. Correct me if I'm wrong. We see an evolution here of Buddhism in Singapore, beginning first in folk and local traditions that are imported, moving into an institutional and monastic situation, And then, if I understand correctly, a real kind of burst of growth, a change in these institutions as they transform in the face of humanistic challenges and create new organizations, new institutions, engage in new activities. And of course, I'm going to open it up to the floor, but before that, I'd like to ask just one question, if I might. And you might ask, well, based on what criteria is to ask our esteemed speaker a question? I also tried Korean, and I also loved it. So in this three-part transformation from kind of folk to institutional to humanistic, that happens at the confluence of these global movements. In that process, then we have these sort of Singapore's own Buddhist legacy is obviously closely intertwined with these global movements. Maybe just before we begin, could you highlight, obviously spend a lot of time on what is being shared, but maybe also highlight for us in that process what's unique to Singaporean Buddhism.
Thank you, Jesse. That's an excellent question. And to think about the kind of uniqueness of Singaporean Buddhism, and I think this is a question that I get asked quite a lot. Is there something as Singaporean Buddhism? Is there something that is local? And I think that's a great question. I think if there are two ways to think about the history of Buddhism in Singapore. I think, first of all, Buddhism in Singapore is always been a kind of a migrant religion, just like Singapore is a kind of migrant society. We came from different parts of the world, and similarly, it's the same for Buddhism in Singapore as well. That how, as I mentioned earlier in my lecture, that Buddhism in Singapore came from China, also from South and Southeast Asia. So at the beginning, it was very much a kind of a migrant religion, we can put it that way. But as Singapore developed, and also by the time after Singapore's independence, Buddhist organizations have also taught about localization, also promoting ideas that are relevant to Singapore society. And I think a good example would be the case of Venerable Yen Pei. And Venerable Yen Pei, he was a migrant from China. But after he came to Singapore, he realized that he had to make Buddhism relevant to Singapore society. So when he started the Informed Prashna Auditorium, he actually introduced the Sunday school program, which is more modern after the kind of churches that he saw in Singapore. He also promoted ideas that were important to Singapore society at the time, and sometimes those were not exactly directly tied to Buddhism. For example, as I mentioned, organ donation or kidney dialysis. So this was what Singapore needed at the time. So he was able to incorporate Buddhist ideas and make them relevant to the time. At the Taiwanese organizations that arrived in Singapore in the 80s and 90s. Many of them have localized into Singapore society. For example, they introduced Chinese Mahayana language classes in English. For example, they introduced activities that are relevant to the Singapore community. So these are the ways that we see the kind of localization of the organization. And I think, especially for global organizations such as Guangzhou and Shiji, they are very familiar of the need to localize when they establish branches in, for example, in Europe, North America, and West Africa. They realize that they have to localize and stick to the community and not be like a Chinese or Taiwanese organization, because that will create a distance and they will not be able to connect. And that actually goes against the idea of humanistic Buddhism in a way, to make Buddhism in a way relevant to human. So thanks so much for this question.
Thank you. Yes, so maybe one of the defining characteristics then, as you say, is this responsiveness of Singaporean Buddhist communities to the moment. And that's a defining feature.
Yeah. Doesn't mean.
And maybe speaking of engagement and the community, I'd like to open up the floor as well for questions. And I want to encourage our audience to ask questions both in English, if you like, or Chinese. Please. So if we have any questions, don't be afraid to raise your hand.
Thank you, Jack, for such a wonderful talk. We are in working as for 100 years. History. I'm most interested in the second part about the more or less contemporary condition of humanistic Buddhism in Singapore, especially after the arrival of Guoguangshan and Ciji, right? Arguably, these are the two probably most globally famous and powerful Buddhist organizations. So I'm curious about their relationship with the existing the Buddhist organizations here, both monastic and lay organizations like Chinese or the Taixu. So in a way, after they arrived and made efforts to integrate in Singapore society, what kind of relationship did they develop with their counterparts, local counterparts? Were they mostly collaborative or subtly competing for a religious market? Thank you.
That's an excellent and controversial question I asked. Excellent one. So I would say that on the one hand, it is kind of a collaborative kind of I would say relationship on the one hand. So the collaboration as well, where Guoguangshan and Ciji collaborate with, for instance, Singapore Buddhist Federation, also prominent Buddhist organizations, including to represent Singapore at visa events, and also collaborate in terms of, for instance, social welfare activities. So we do see forms of collaboration in a way. But then on the other hand, of course, you're absolutely right. There's competition and tension. And especially, I would say the competition is more with the kind of smaller, more traditional Chinese Buddhist organization. Because in fact, smaller Chinese Buddhist organizations are losing their members not only to the more prominent like Taiwanese Buddhist groups like Guoguangshan and Ciji, but also the more prominent Singapore Buddhist organizations, for example, like to declare number, for example, like Humanistic or Taixu, which have a lot more support, more activity, but many smaller organizations lack membership, and of course with that also lack donation as well. So we also see the kind of tension as well. And also to think about it in a more broader kind of context as well, that in Singapore, and very often when we think about religious conversion as well, we often think about inter-religious conversion, right? That one convert from one religion to another. But in the Buddhist context, there's a lot of intra-religious conversion, like Buddhists from one organization or one tradition converting to another. That happens. So there are Buddhists within a Mahayana tradition moving from one organization to a more humanistic Buddhism one. But there are also Buddhists that they convert to, like, say, Theravada or Vajrayana Buddhist organization. So there's also this kind of competition and in some ways tension as well. So across Buddhist organizations in Singapore.
Thanks, Jack, for the very wonderful talk. I have two questions, mostly on the first one, which is on Taixu. You mentioned that he faces a lot of resistance when he was suggesting reform here in China. So could you elaborate more about why and who? That's the first question. Then the second one is I would say, is it a thesis that the 人生佛教 become 人间佛教? And in Chinese, every single character will make a big difference. So I wonder why somebody who change it from 人生 to 人间, and how does it really impact the original idea of Taixu?
Okay, thanks very much. So first question about the resistance towards Taixu. So Taixu at the time when he was promoting this idea of 人生佛教, but also the kind of Buddhist revival movement of 佛教复兴运动, he actually met with quite a bit of resistance from the more conservative Buddhist monks of the time, and those included, for example, one of his classmates, Yuan Ying, was not very supportive of his reforms because Taixu's reform in a way was considered quite radical, thinking about ecumenical Buddhism, talking about inspiring the young, to changing the curriculum of Buddhist seminary. So those were considered quite controversial to the more conservative-minded monastics who were more pro-reform, but they did not like his reform. And there were also Buddhists that were against him, and of course those who were some of the Pure Land practitioners, they prefer this idea of deciding the name of Buddha for salvation rather than thinking about religion or about building Buddhist seminaries, which they thought were not in a way useful for the context. And of course, that actually caused a bit of the kind of tensions as well. So one of the very interesting things that I actually observed in some of the primary sources was that the Taixu, during this time, he promoted Buddhist education, but also Buddhist research. So he actually started this Buddhist magazine known as Haichaoyin. And in fact, Haichaoyin was very popular among reform-minded Buddhist monks, but it was a banned publication in many Buddhist institutions that were against his idea. So there was this very interesting, if I remember correctly, it was in the autobiography of the paper. So before he went to Yunnan Foshui, he actually encountered Taixu's idea, and and in fact, his friend had to smuggle copies of Haichaoyin so that they could read about his ideas. And that was also what inspired him to eventually travel south to study at Yunnan Foshui with Master Taixu. So that was one of the major reasons for that. So second question about the shift, right, from religion Fojia to religion Fojia. There are many scholars have different explanations for that, but one of the very common explanations got to do with Master Ying Shun, who was one of the major disciples of Master Taixu. So one of the reasons was because of Master Ying Shun's interpretation of the religion Fojia, but then he situated that in the context of early Indian Buddhism. So in fact, Master Ying Shun published several books about Indian Fojia, Hindu Fojia, and several other Hindu Fojia, one of the very prominent books on Indian Buddhism, and how he arrived at this point, idea where how the Buddha is in this world. And of course, one of his very prominent essay was Fojia Renqian, if I remember correctly. And because of this essay, Fojia Renqian, right, then the term Renqian Fojia became popularized by him and his followers. But this idea of Renqian Fojia that Master Ying Shun promoted was actually more of a scholastic, more academic interpretation of Renqian Fojia. But of course, his disciple, Venerable Zheng Yan, the founder of Ciji, later popularized this vision of Renqian Fojia to be a more social, philanthropic, welfare vision of Renqian Fojia in the Ciji context. So it's pretty much, I would say, the same in some of the other Taiwanese organizations as well. They have different ideas and interpretations of Renqian Fojia, but I would say that this term became popularized early on by Master Taixu as a more of a scholastic kind of category rather than a more broad-based, popular social action kind of like humanistic Buddhist movement. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Pasha. Thank you so much for your lecture. I wanted to ask about the analogy that you made earlier with in reference to the Salvation Army in terms of the institution, the kind of uniform rank. You also mentioned like the concept of Sunday schools in your response to the first question. I wanted to ask if your research did uncover like that these influences of non-Buddhist origin were actually kind of shaping contemporary Buddhist institutions that you mentioned.
Sorry, can you clarify?
I wanted to ask, like in a sense, was it clear that like these other non-Buddhist influences were actually influencing and shaping, and that's why they have all this, or was it just an analogy of bringing up so that we could understand it better? Yeah, I wanted to find out. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I would say yes, in a way that I brought that up not only as example, but that was actually one of the main reasons for the broader rise of human life Buddhism over humanistic Buddhism. Because for Master Taixu, when he reformed his vision of human life Buddhism was in fact very much also influenced not only by kind of Western science and democracy, which was the time of the new cultural movement, but also he received the kind of ideas and influence from the Christian churches as well, with the rise of Christianity, with the signing of the unequal treaty that opened up the kind of ports in China. So that's where he also encountered kind of like Christian ideas and churches that he thought actually would benefit Buddhism. So that's why for Master Taixu's vision, it was very much kind of influenced by, I would say, Western ideas of the time. And in the case of Tzu Chi, absolutely. In fact, in Master Zheng Yan's autobiography, she actually mentioned that she got this idea of Tzu Chi kind of social welfare from the Catholics. In fact, she, if I remember correctly, in the autobiography, she mentioned that she met Catholic nuns who were engaging in social welfare and charity, and that actually inspired her to think about Buddhist involvement in charity. And of course, because she was very much inspired by this idea of humanistic Buddhism by her teacher, Master Yin Shun, so that became a kind of a very nice kind of connection from humanistic Buddhism to actual social action and Buddhist philanthropy. But in other words, I would say that, yeah, that Tzu Chi was in a way influenced by kind of Catholic ideas of charity, not so much a Salvation Army. It was more of an example that I gave to draw the parallels, but indeed it was inspired by Christian kind of Catholic welfare services. So I think on that, to think about that in a more broader skew, right, that actually Buddhists have always been engaging in social welfare and philanthropy throughout historical time. So this is actually, again, nothing new. But I think what was new, and I think that was something that Professor Hua also has very nicely talked about in her book, is that what is new is that Buddhist organizations are becoming more NGO-like, right? So we are looking at it as more of a secular social organizations rather than at the old school kind of temple offering welfare, which has always been the case, right? Throughout, if we look at the case in imperial Chinese history, in the history of mainland Southeast Asia, or even in Sri Lanka, they have always been engaging in social welfare services and philanthropy. But we see the rise of more Buddhist NGOs and a kind of a secular, religious, charitable organization. So I think that is something that is, I would say, new in a way.
Thank you so much for your response.
Thank you.
Yes, we have another question.
Yeah.
Hi, Prof. Thank you for the talk. Kind of related to the previous question, I was wondering, during the 1900s, when all these Buddhist institutions and NGOs were being set up, I was wondering if there was any meaningful interaction between Buddhist institutions and institutions from other religions, whether either like positive or negative.
That's a great question. Short answer is yes, there are collaborations, and of course, Buddhist organizations in Singapore engage in a lot of interfaith, not only dialogue but collaboration. So absolutely, that many Buddhist groups have collaborated with other religious organizations, not only in terms of promoting religious harmony, but also in terms of social welfare activities. But in terms of actual kind of collaboration, I must say that I'm not really an expert on that. And also I don't think anyone has written anything on that. So that's actually a good topic for further research to think about, the kind of interfaith collaboration in social charity and social welfare kind of activities. I think this will be a great topic. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah.
To align with the spread of Buddhism from southeastern coast of China to the Nanyang, I will ask my question in Chinese. 我想谢谢你答这个非常精彩的问题。可能不只是佛教，任何宗教要开创性口一种发展，需要非常优秀的，就是这个佛学的导师。我想提问题是，目前的新加坡，我们在这边已经应该是发展完善、落地生根了的这个佛学教育、佛法训练，有在怎么样的一种或者是能够。目前的发展能够为我们带来怎么样的期待？能够培养出我们本土的，像你所提到这些南来的高僧一样的，能够把佛教的这个思想提升到另外一个境界，或是开创一种新事物的。我想在这方面可能有学习的，想向你请教一下。
谢谢梁老师。So maybe I will very quickly translate Professor Liu's question. He asked about the question on Buddhist education. So what Buddhist organizations in Singapore are doing to promote Buddhist education and also to cultivate the next generation of Buddhist educators and parents. So 我先用中文回应，然后我再换成英文。而且提到很好的问题，就是其实新加坡当然就是刚才我提到，就是许多佛教团体比较重视佛教教育这一块，那包括了开设佛学班。还有就是以及新加坡也有一些佛教团体成立了佛学院，包括在华明山成立了新加坡佛学院，就是南传的南达拉比哈拉祝福寺也有这个帕利布的叫帕利文佛学院，所以这些佛学班以及佛学院都在培育，就是下一代算是所谓的弘法人才，以及就是下一代能够就是带动新加坡佛教发展的一些算是领袖。那其实这也是许多佛教团体面临一个比较大的问题。那第一呢，就是其实对于这些佛学班或者这些佛学院课程感兴趣的新加坡人其实非常的少，所以其实佛学班很多时候包括我本身之前上佛学班，大多数的都是退休人士比较多，所以其实这是他们面临的比较大的一个问题。那另外一个问题呢，其实呢也是有许多新加坡就是出家的这些出家众。我们有新加坡经常提到的所谓人才流失，这种 brain drain 的问题。佛教团体也有所谓的身材流失，那佛教的 brain drain 的问题呢，就是有很多新加坡出家的这些出家法师，后来他们会比较希望选择到，就是如果是汉传佛教的法师，可能会选择到中国大陆或台湾学习，后来就在那里就是留下来弘法或者居住。那也有一些像南传出家的新加坡人会选择到泰国或者缅甸斯里兰卡学习，后来也就不选择回到新加坡，因为可能觉得那里的生活还是他们比较觉得是对于修行上比较有帮助的，所以其实也是一个面临的问题。所以其实有许多佛教团体现在面临一个比较大的一个挑战，是如何就是能够开设一些佛学课程或者一些活动，能够更好的推广佛教，对不对？吸引年轻人来学佛，所以这是一个很大的一个问题，也是很多佛教团体大家关注的一个问题。那please allow me to translate my response to Professor Liu. So for Buddhist organizations in Singapore, they have tried to promote Buddhist education in two ways. First, the establishment of Buddhist classes like Dharma classes that I mentioned earlier, and also the establishment of Buddhist seminaries. So some Buddhist organizations in Singapore, including the Commemorating Monastery, has established the Buddhist College of Singapore. The Mangala Vihara Theravada organization has established the Pali Buddhist College, right? But the challenge is that this Dharma classes and the Buddhist seminaries do not attract the masses, right? In fact, the number of Buddhists enrolled in these courses, the enrollment is in fact very low, right? So they are more concerned about the enrollment than over FASS. Alright, so enrollment is a major concern for many Buddhist organizations, right? There's very low enrollment, and of course, in fact, I remember when I attended Dharma classes myself many years ago, most of my classmates were retirees, right? So this is also a challenge that how Buddhist organizations can make their courses or program more attractive to the younger generation. But I also mentioned that there's also another challenge for the Singapore Buddhist community, is that in Singapore we often talk about brain drain, right? That many talented Singaporeans don't come back to Singapore. And in the Buddhist community, there's that brain drain as well. That many Singaporean Buddhist monastics would prefer to be educated. For Mahayana monastics, they would prefer to receive Buddhist monastic education in mainland China or Taiwan. For Theravada Buddhist monastic, they would prefer to go to Sri Lanka, Thailand, or Myanmar. And many of them, after several years of studying and also because of the Buddhist community they built there, they do not come back to Singapore. So that is also a challenge that we encounter, that I observe among the Singaporean Buddhist community. So that's also the problem of brain drain. So many Buddhist organizations today are very concerned about the kind of aging Buddhist leadership, and also they are trying to find ways to make Buddhist classes and programs more attractive to the younger generation.
So,
Maybe just, yes, one question.
sorry.
No, please go.
Okay, so thank you. That was a wonderful talk. I'm glad I ended my class early and started over here. So I have a very interesting, hopefully interesting question for you. And that is, I know humanistic Buddhism is about really offering a methodology for the mass to practice Buddhism and to achieve community and joy through the practice of charity and giving. So as you know, I grew up in Thailand, and in Thailand, they, of course, the practice Theravada Buddhism, where all Buddhist families wake up at 5:38 in the morning and give food and offer alms to the monks who come into the neighborhood. So that's also a form of having the mass or the lay Buddhists practice the rituals of giving. So in your expert view, compared to that practice, which is every morning, everybody practices it as a ritual, as a habit, versus the humanistic Buddhism, which is having organized charitable organizations and so forth. Which one do you think is more effective, if you will, to achieving a world of peace and joy, which is the objective of humanistic Buddhism?
Oh, wow. The thing is, thanks for this really great question. And I think that's a difficult one because that question is also, I think, tied to the broader question about the kind of differences between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, in which both Theravada and Mahayana Buddhist community will claim that their practice.
My question isn't going to get an answer, but rather to comment on the underlying philosophical difference between the two schools, why they approach it differently for the same objective, which is to spread joy to the world. Basically, that's almost the objective of all religions. So just a little bit of your thoughts on why they chose the two different practices.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so far I think for the Theravada context, Theravada Buddhists place a lot more emphasis on personal self-cultivation to achieve enlightenment. So of course, giving is a very important practice in Theravada Buddhism, but the idea of giving is usually seen as a part of self-cultivation towards oneself, which is quite different from the kind of more Mahayana type interpretation of giving, which is usually framed in the kind of context of the Bodhisattva. So maybe I explain this in because this is a very kind of complex kind of Buddhist doctrine, but let me try to explain it in a simple way as I can. So in the kind of Theravada context, when one practices giving, the practice of giving, and also in the case of merit making, is very much directed towards oneself, in terms of one's self-cultivation. Is usually not framed in the kind of context of the kind of Bodhisattva, where one will give and in a way of achieving enlightenment for oneself and others. But in the kind of Mahayana context, in terms of the kind of Bodhisattva practice, they believe that the idea of giving is not only to benefit oneself, is to benefit the entire community, so that when one achieves enlightenment, one is to achieve enlightenment together with others, right? So this is the more of the kind of Mahayana Bodhisattva kind of spirit. And of course, there's a kind of disagreement in terms of the kind of interpretation. The Theravada would believe that the idea of merit making, of the giving, is the closest form of giving, right? The kind of alms giving that goes all the way back to the Buddha's time. Because Theravada Buddhists believe that the kind of their teachings and the kind of lineage trees all the way back to the Buddha's time. But the kind of Mahayana kind of practice is actually very much based on the kind of Mahayana set doctrines, on the practice of the Bodhisattva path, on the idea of the the idea of six perfections, or the six paramita, and of course the very first perfection is the perfection of giving, which is something that Theravada Buddhists do not quite, in a way, agree with the kind of Bodhisattva kind of practice. But I would say that we see similarities in the two different schools. There's also a lot of emphasis on this idea of generosity and giving, just that the idea of giving and how they interpret it based on the kind of Buddhist doctrines can be quite different. Yeah, thank you.
So just before we end, I would like to just ask one quick question if I might have used my role as moderator once more. Maybe we're approaching this 100-year commemoration that you talked about, and you've explored so much about these different manifestations of humanistic Buddhism. And I couldn't help but notice in your talk that the sort of situational environment in which these sorts of ideas or activities or organizations come to be often unsettling or during upheavals. We have colonialism or war, the Sino-Japanese War, the Vietnam War. And we're entering into a period of uncertainty now. So what do you think, if we asked you to sort of distill something from Taixu or these other kind of masters of the moment, or those who sort of sought to transform or engage or even improve the moment, what might be a lesson that Taixu might give us for today's environment?
That's a great question. I wish I could predict that. It's something
Inspirational, yes.
but I think you're absolutely right that, in fact, if we look at the history of Buddhism, often Buddhists and Greek masters, reformers, emerged during the time of social unrest, in terms of social political changes. I think it's pretty much the same in the case of Master Taixu. If you think about his time, if you situate him in the context of the end of the Qing dynasty, the establishment of the Republic of China, the Republican period, and then the Sino-Japanese War. Yeah, absolutely. I think the kind of context, the kind of environment that they encountered actually does shape the kind of vision of reform and change, and also what they thought would be important and relevant to that time. So I think it would be pretty much the same as well if you think about the rise of Greek Buddhist teachers in a modern context. And of course, I have friends who told me that given the time of social change and also unrest, it's likely that we're going to see the rise of new religious leaders with different visions and ideas of promoting harmony and compassion in the kind of divided world. And I think this is something that we really need. So maybe we will have another, Taixu in years to come.
Great, thank you so much, and I hope you'll be there to research whoever that is.
Now, our presentation of the token of appreciation, may I invite Dr. Tim Ching Ting, Deputy University Librarian, present our tokens of appreciation.
Thank you.
May I invite the head of the history of the department, Professor Ron, and our library representatives, Ms. Gandhi McPhee, Mr. Herman, and Taixu to take a motion.
Sure. I can get like the Japanese like
Thank you. We have now come to the end of the lecture segment, but please do not leave yet. We will begin our short curator's tour of the physical exhibition very soon, and after which there will be refreshments provided at the multi-purpose room on the same floor. In the meantime, may I also take about 2 minutes of your time to scan the QR code on this slide over here and fill in an e-feedback form. And remember to indicate the program as Taixu. For those who will join the guided tour, we will flash this QR code again later. With that, we would like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. I hope that you have truly enjoyed your time and enjoy the tour later. Enjoy the refreshment and the networking session. And we definitely hope to see all of you again. Thank you. Thank you.